Okay.
Okay, so Samach Aleph, Amid Aleph. Last week we moved on a little bit from the discussion of Neshech and Ribis to understand why there is a separate pasuk in the Torah for Ribis when we have a pasuk for Ono and for Gezel, and they all seem to be in the same realm. Why do you need a pasuk for each? So the Gemara went through and told us why we need a pasuk for Ono because it doesn't work, and why it doesn't need a pasuk for Ribis. But when we came to Gezel, since the bottom line is that what is Gezel? So Gezel is the taking of something from someone else. And by definition, that's what ribis is, and that's what oinah is. So when you get really down to it, the Gemara is asking, why do you need a pasuk by Gezel when the whole theme of Gezel is already through those other 2 points? And so the Gemara conceded and said, you know what, you're right, that at least from that standpoint, we don't need a separate pasuk from Gezel. But now the Gemara is going to sort of backtrack and say, okay, I get it from the standpoint of definition, that the definition of Gezel applies to the other two. But still, we're going to need a pasuk for Gezel even for other reasons. So that's where we're going today, is that we're going to ask this kasha. It's about maybe, I don't know, 15, 18 lines from the bottom. The Gemara is going to say as follows, Omre. So the Chachamim said, okay, based on what we just learned, Hachenami. It's true that we can learn Gezel from Oino and from Ribis. It's true. Ella la begezel lomali. So now, why do we need Gezel? So it's got a rhetorical question. I agree. You're right. So why do we need Gezel? So the Gemara says, Gezel, the way we understand it, it's an armed robbery. I come to you and I rob you. No, the kovesh schar sochim. It's something different. It is, Gezel means if you hire somebody to do work and you don't pay him, that's Gezel. So think about it a minute. We think of regular Gezel as an armed robbery. Someone comes, robs you of your money. That's Gezel. We all know that. But now, and we're going to see from the pasuk how that works out, that the Gezel is inherent in not paying somebody that you owe money. If you owe, he works for you, you owe him wages, right? Schar. And there's a pasuk in the Torah that says you have to pay the schar of a worker. It's a favorite pasuk, but we'll get to it. So, but yet it's also Gezel. So he says, "Kovish chasoche behedjuk sipre." Frank the Gemara, you're going to tell me that you want to give an answer. That really we don't need Gezel because Oino and Ribis tell us Gezel. So why do you need Gezel? Because to pay for a worker. We have a Beferish Apostle, Sashik Socha Oni Evyon, that when it comes to the wages of an Oni and an Evyon, doesn't mean, and again, it doesn't matter if he's poor or not poor, but an Oni de Evyon, that you're not allowed to take away. You're going to tell me this is Gezel. So how can that be Gezel? There's a pasuk that says, "On this subject, lo sashik." So the kasha now goes back to, why do you need Gezel? If you want to say that Gezel is because of another reason other than just taking, that reason also seems to fall by the wayside. Answers the Gemara, lava or lov b'shnei lav. So this is the chiddush. The chiddush is that when you withhold payment from somebody else, yes, you have a pasuk l'sashik, but you also have Gezel. So in other words, there are two isurim, not one. There are two isurim. That's how Homer, the Torah says it is not to pay somebody that you owe money for wages, that you're over two lavin, one of l'sashik and one of l'sigzah. Okay, so this is a tremendous chiddush that we learned. So let's look at Rashi. Let's see where the Rashi is. Normally, la beribis la begezel. So we're going to back up. The Rashi in the middle of the page says, "Yolamdu b'mizeh shebekulam chasam." That's what we started out by saying. They're all chisar and mammon. Shebeschase es chaveri, you're taken away. Okay, so there's no particular Rashi on this section, but what we're now saying is that Gezel has two interpretations. It has the classic interpretation of what we call armed robbery, and we have to distinguish because the Gemara is going to talk about Geneva shortly, and Geneva and Gezel are two different things. So we have a Verish Pasuk L'Sigzol, and then we have L'Sashik Star Onivi Evion, which is a separate pasuk in Devarim that tells us that you cannot take away from the wages. And the Gemara is mechadish that also means for gezel. Correct? The Gemara Balukma Beribis Vaina. So now the Gemara is going to turn the tables. If you're going to tell me that gezel is a powerful tool to allow for a second lav on someone who doesn't pay wages, right? The Gemara of the Lukma Berivis Vaina, V'lav B'shnei Lavin. Then why don't we say, if that's the definition, let's say by Oino, you're over Oino and you're over Gezel. Let's say by Ribis, you're over Ribis and over Gezel. If Gezel becomes an overarching sin that isn't just the classic form. I'm using classic because that's how we know Gezel to be. But Gezel is inherent in other Averis. Then says the Gemara, if you're now going to say that it's a second lav, let it be a second lav by Ribis or by Ino. Why not? The lav alone b'shnei lavin. And for the Gemara, Davaham Lamed in Yonoi. We say this in davening, Davaham in Yonoi is in the Seichoi, that it's the reason why it applies to Losashik and not the others is because you learn it from the context of the pasuk in which is in, and the context of the pasuk in which we take a look in the Chumash, but the context of Losashik, it doesn't say Gezel by Yod, it doesn't say Gezel by Ribis, so you can't sort of make that leap and say, oh. But if you take a look in Kedoshim, in Sefer Vayikra, it says lo sasha kesrei echa v'lo sigzol. So the word lo sigzol, gezela, appears right next to the term lo sasha, which is why the Gemara says, now I can understand because they're lumped together, that lo sasha is an avera, v'lo sigzol. So we can make a hemshech. We can say, oh, that because we have the one, we have the other. But you can't do that by Oino and Ribis because by Oino and Ribis there is no sigzol. The word doesn't apply. So that's what he means. Dova halamed minyanai, that you learn it from the inyan that you're in. You're in the inyan of loisasha, and you have the words loisigzol. So the Torah means to couple them. That when you're over that lav, you're over two lavin at the same time. And even from the homiletic standpoint, every avera is an avera. You can't, one avera bigger than the other avera. But the avera of l'sashoik is you're taking someone who's desperate and he needs the money, he needs the work. You're making him work, he works, and then you don't pay him, or you don't pay him on time even. It's even if paying on time is an important consideration. You can't withhold the payment and say, I'll pay you tomorrow. If he finishes the work today, you've got to pay him today. That's what the Torah means. But yet we have this rachmanis, this compassion on a person who is desperate for the money because it's not just for him. He has people rely on him. So therefore, the Gemara says that the Torah means to say that how strong it is that you have to pay someone on time is that there's two lavin, not just one. So that's how the Gemara concludes and tells us that that Lesigzol can be learned from Oino and from Ribis, But Loisigzel has another definition which doesn't apply to honor and ribis, and that is that when a person has to be paid wages, you're over the law of Loisigzel. But really the Gemara concedes that we wouldn't need a pasuk for Loisigzel because we have honor and we have ribis, which tells us the same thing. So that's how the Gemara concludes. And the Gemara just finishes up and says, "Ubinyana de socher ksiv," and like we just said, in the Indian of schilus of paying wages, he says loisigzel. Okay, so that answers that particular question, right? So now, as I said before, we now have the three categories: ribis, oino, and gizela. Now the Gemara is going to go a little further. We'll shortly get back to ribis and meshach, but this is a little bit of a little side discussion, because now we have another concept called loisignavu, that you shouldn't steal, which is not gizela. Like the Gemara loisignavu the kasva chmana lamali. Now that you're telling me all these chedushim right, and gizela means that you're taking someone from something from someone, which is why ribis and oino are the same, but isn't geneva the same? There is a difference, of course, we know between geneva and gazela, but the concept of gazela that you're taking from someone, that applies to geneva too, just like oino, or just like ribis. So based on what you're telling me, that the whole cheshbon is Gizela means taking something from someone, including the wages that we just talked about, then why do you need loisignavu? Torah tells us loisignavu, and it's the same concept. So the Gemara says, the chedatanya. So we need it because what we learned in the following brayso, loisignav amanas lemeket. In other words, this is a chiddush. This is a tremendous chiddush that we would not even have thought about. So the reason why it says loisignav, and by the way, which we'll talk about, loisignav, when the Torah mentions it in the Aseret Dibros, is not stealing money. We all know loisignav means stealing a nefesh. It really refers to kidnapping. That's what the Torah means in the Aseret Dibros when it says loisignav. It means actually kidnapping someone, but nevertheless, the whole concept of loisignav speaks to the same underlying conditions that occur in Gizela. Says the Gemara, no. We have the following brayso, which says as follows: like tignav al manas lema'et, that the avera of loisignav, you have no intention of stealing from someone. That's not your intention. You just want to make life difficult for him. You want him to be upset. You want him to be angry. You don't mean to steal from him, meaning that you're actually going to take something from him and not return it. You're going to return it. You're going to return it. But you want him to feel bad. So says the brayso, loisignav also covers a situation where the geneva isn't for the sake of the geneva, it's for the sake of annoying and making someone feel bad. That's how far loisignav goes. Or, says the brayso, loisignav al manas l'shalom t'shlufi kefa. This is a novel approach. I want to do you a favor. I want to give you a gift. I want to give you money because you need it. I know you need it, and I know that you're going to be reluctant to take it. So what do? I steal it from you. What's the halacha by geneva? That if you're caught and you have to go to Bezdin, you pay kefil. What is kefil? Kefil is double what you stole. So imagine a person is going to go to great lengths to say, I need to help this fellow and you won't take my money. I'm going to go ahead and steal from him. And then I'm going to let the Bezdin prosecute me. And then I'm going to have to pay him kefil. And that's how I'm going to give him money. It's the only way I can give him money. Imagine how far-fetched, in a way, that is. That brayso says that that's loisignav, that you're not supposed to steal not for the stealing, for the sake of stealing, but for the sake of an ulterior purpose, which isn't necessarily a negative. Giving someone a gift is a very, very nice thing. If you give him a matana to help someone, but the only way you can do it is by stealing his money and then being prosecuted. Says the Brisa that's why we need lo signavu. You're right. We don't need lo signavu for the purpose of telling us that you can't do it, because that we can learn from the other psukim where you're not allowed to take advantage of someone and take his money. But here we have a greater purpose, is that the Gemara tells us that you shouldn't make someone's life difficult by stealing, even though it's going to come back to him, and also for the purpose of giving him a matana, you're not allowed to steal. So this is very unusual. Because there was no intention to steal for the sake of stealing. It was for the sake of something else. And you would think, oh, that's not so gefährlich. Says the Torah, lo signavu, that is included in Geneva. Okay? All right, so we've kind of answered these questions now on Geneva, Gezela, Ribis, I know. So now the Gemara goes into another tangent before we return to our Gemara. The Gemara asks the Kasha with regard to the separate pasuk in the Torah, Losasu Ovo B'Mishpat B'Mida B'Mashkel B'Mesura. So we know from the Torah, the same parsha in Vayikra, that a person is not supposed to. It doesn't use the word signavu. It says loisasu ovel b'mishpat. You shouldn't do a wrongdoing, not the same, but you shouldn't do a wrongdoing b'mishpat, in judgment. B'mida, mida means measurement. When you measure something, it's a foot, 2 feet, 3 feet. B'mishkol, in weights, which we all know, and b'mesura, in and we'll see in a minute, we have a separate pasuk, a separate Indian from the surah, which is I sell you a gallon of milk and I'm giving you 3/4 of a gallon. That's the surah. It has to do with liquid rather than something else. And we'll see why that's important. So Frek the Gemara, so Oma le Yema le Ravashi Lab the Kasav Rachman Vishkalas Lamali. Why do I need, just like we were saying before by Geneva and Gezela, why do I need a separate kasam to tell me that you can't fool around with mishkal, with weights? We see that. Why? Because again, what's the underlying point? You're taking someone from someone, taking something from someone. So once you have a taking, we already have a no and ribis. And again, the reason why it's in this whole Indian is because ribis is a overarching halacha in the Torah, and we see so many things that come from ribis, not just lending, not just giving, charging interest, which is derisa, or in negotiations in business, which is the Rabbanan. But you see that the point of ribis goes well beyond just these cases of interest. It goes to many other cases. So why do you need a pasuk by Mishkal? You have ribis. Ribis tells us that you can't take something improperly from someone else, and that's what Mishkal is, right? Once you go into business and you start fooling around with weights, and something weighs this, and you're charging him that's already an issue. So that's the Gemara's kasha. So Amalei, so Rav Ashi answered him back with Taimim Mishkal of the Melach. Again, these are things that we don't even have any understanding, but yet in the Gemara, we're told that that you need mishkal for a different reason, not for the reason that we think, oh, you're stealing something or you're taking something from someone else, which we already know in the Torah, but it has to do, which I wasn't aware of, that if you put a mishkal, a weight, a scale, and you bury it in melach, in salt, then that salt eats into the mishkal and changes its property. What does that mean? for instance, if you calibrate a weight, which is right, that's the halacha, and that's even our times. You seal a weight in order to make sure that it's sealed to be exactly, let's say, a pound. You don't fool around. Now you bury it in salt, and nobody knows that. And you the salt, and all of a sudden the mishko doesn't weigh a pound; it weighs 15 ounces. So now you're going to take this weight. I'm going to sell you a pound worth of anything, meat, but I'm only going to give you 15 ounces, not 16 ounces. Why? Because the mishko, the property of the mishko has been changed by dipping it in salt. So this is a chiddush to me, maybe to all of us. So you need, again, why do we need mishko? We know it from Oino, and we know it from ribis. There it is, because when you bury it in salt, it changes the weight. And as a result of the changing of the weight, you would think, okay, so what's gefährlich? Now, the mishkal is still the mishkal, but since you change the weight, therefore it's a chiddush that you're also over the lav. It's a form of stealing. In fact, the Gemara Hana Gezel Mal Yehu. Okay, so you're telling me that you need it because of this change in property. But think about it a minute. If you're changing the property of the mishkal, that's gzela, or gneva, or gzela. That's gzela. So now we're back to square one. Why do we need why do we need an isser, a mishkal? Because maybe you're going to fiddle around with the weights and make it so that someone is going to think he got a pound and didn't. But that's gazela. By definition, that means you've stolen from him. So now we have back to the first point, we have a pasuk by gazela. Why doesn't gazela cover all instances where someone is not giving something to someone that he should, whether it's the mishkal or the mido or in any form of transaction? If I cheat you because I don't give you what you bargained for, that's gazela. So that's the Gemara's kasha. Why do we need mishkal? We have gazela, even with the chiddush of the melach. But bottom line, you're stealing from someone. And by stealing from someone, it all falls back on the same point. Says the Gemara, lava Allah mishas asiya. So this is another chiddush, is that when are you over the isser of gazela? When you go ahead and you rob someone, you take his money. When you've taken his money, that's when the lav occurs. Until you've taken his money, there's no isser gazela. Until you've taken advantage of someone, there's no isser of ribis. Ribis means that the transaction has been completed, and I have taken from you something that I shouldn't have. I know it's the same way, they're all the same way. Gineva is the same way. But here, the chiddush is, if you take an instrument like a mishkal and you put it in the salt with the idea that the salt is going to change its property to make it not exactly what the weight should be, you're over the law the minute you do that. Not when I come into your store and I'm buying a pound's worth of something and you're selling me 15 ounces. Now you've cheated me. No, the act is already from the time of the asiya, from the time of the committing of the offense by taking it and burying it in the salt. That's a gewaldige chiddush, because we normally say, that how can I only the Rebbeinu Shalom Yodea Machshavos, right? Yodea's Machshavos. And how can we introduce something that if I'm doing something already to fiddle, then I know I'm going to cheat somebody? What happens? I mean, theoretically, I could be doing it and never do a transaction with anybody, right? I put it in, and then for some reason I don't do business with that mishkal. So you would think, oh, you haven't done business with that particular weight, then you shouldn't be over alive. Says the Gemara, but mishkal means that when you take a weight with the idea that you're going to cheat someone, whether you've cheated him or not, you're already over alive. That's a tremendous chiddush. So the Gemara wants to say that's why it says Mishkel in the Torah is because it's not just Gezela or Geneva or like the other Isurim, which you're over when you do it, right? Only when you take the ribbis or take the Aino. Here, it goes one step further. If you're preparing, it's already an Isur. That's a very big hinge. Very big hinge. Okay. So now, that's why it says B'mishkel. I'll tell you. Particularly. Now the Gemara is going to go into that whole discussion where we saw from the pasuk of the Torah, Lasasu Ovo B'mishpat B'mida B'mishkel B'mesur. So the Gemara is going to explain that a little bit further. Tana Rabbanan, it says in the pasuk Lasasu Ovo B'mishpat B'mida B'mishkel B'mesura. So each one is a separate Isser. It's a separate wrongdoing. Bamida, what is Bamida? Mida means like you take a yardstick or a ruler or in those days, we'll see the Gemara says they used to take, in order to cordon off a piece of property, they would take a rope and they would start at a point. And by the way, that's the way, we do that today too in real estate when you have specific measurements for, let's say a person buys an acre. How do you know what's an acre is? So you have to start from a point, and then you take a measure and you start walking with that measure until you reach another point. So that's what Mida means. Mida means that you're using the length, whether it's a rope or a stick, whatever it happens to be. That's what it is. So the Gemara, Zu Midas Karka. That's the way Karka, land, is measured. It's measured by Mida. So again, think about it. Maybe you don't think about this all the time. If you take a rope and you measure, if you're measuring in the wet season, that rope will get wet and may expand. If you measure it in the dry season, it'll contract. So if you want to measure of something, it has to be totally correct. You can't measure, he says, for one person, for somebody else, because then your measure will, even though you haven't physically, purposely done anything to change the measure, but because the measure. Okay, maybe today we use what do you call that?
Laser.
Today, laser, or even before lasers, we had this metal, right? This metal thing that we pulled out.
Just tape measure. Yeah.
Tape measure, right. So, a tape measure or a laser isn't going to be effective. But in the time of the Gemara, they used something whose properties could change. So he says that you shouldn't cheat someone b'mida by using that particular instrument, which could change depending on the season. That's how far it goes when it says the word mida. Now, we're trying to understand why the Torah has to go through and tell us b'mida, b'mishkal, b'misora, why each one has to be identified. So this is how the Gemara is going to answer. B'mida means that you have to measure uniform, whether it's in one season for everybody. You can't because it'll change. B'mishkal, what is mishkal? Mishkal is a weight. Why? Which we just said before, because you shouldn't take the mishkal and bury it in salt, and therefore it'll change its property because the salt will eat into the measure and will create an imbalance. And by the way, that imbalance, depending on whether you're a buyer or a seller, affects you both ways, because a buyer can also cheat a seller if for instance, if the weight has been altered because of the melach, and he says that so that it's not exactly accurate, so then it could come out that he's going to be buying something, and he'll say, no, I'm buying something and I'm going to pay you. Let's say, how's that going to work? Because but if the measure is inaccurate, then clearly the seller's over a lot, because that he's charging it for a pound when it's not a pound. but it also works the other way. Let's see if Rashi says it exactly how. Um, Metzia saying in Rash's mind, he says, so, Mishkola is because no, okay. So there is a situation, I guess, where a person who is going to be a buyer, um, so how does that work? Okay.
Well, I don't know if this is the case here, but one way it could work is if you're bartering, you're trading, you know, a pound of this for 2 pounds of that because of the price ratio is, 1 to 2. And so if your pound is on the low side, then their 2 pounds is exact, then you're cheating them, kind of a thing.
Right.
Maybe.
So that would be to the advantage of the buyer.
It could be.
Right. Because it works both ways. And I'm just trying to think how it would work in the case of the buyer. Um, that if the mishkal has been altered because of the melach, so what is he going to do? He's going to come in and say that I want the mishkal never gets bigger; it only gets smaller, right? The mishkal doesn't go both ways. But there is a way that the buyer takes advantage of the seller when that weight is in. Unless the no, it can't be the mishkal. The buyer comes in with his own mishkal, and he says, "Here's a mishkal," and and he puts it in salt, which means that it eats into the mishkal and reduces the amount that the mishkal would give him. Um, so again, that doesn't seem to work. I have to think about that because I know that it works for the buyer and for the seller, it's obvious. But even for the buyer could take advantage of the seller through the weight being more by Mishkal. I just don't recall. So I'll have to take a look. But in any event, so Mishkal, so that's why the pasuk by Mishkal is because of the dipping it in the salt. But Masura, what does Masura mean? Masura has to do with liquids. So, for instance, I'm selling you a gallon of milk, okay? And in that gallon, I'm really only giving you, let's say, 7/8 of a gallon. The Gemara's explanation is shelo yartiach, meaning that when you come into a store, or even when you're buying a milkshake, for instance, and the milkshake has to be 16 ounces, and you come in, and the milkshake, when you stir it up, it has the milk, and then it has the foam on top of the milk. The foam on top of the milk doesn't weigh the same as the amount of milk. So when you give someone the milkshake and it has the foam on top of it, and he's paying for 16 ounces, he could only be paying for 15 ounces because it's 15 ounces of milk and 1 ounce of foam. And that foam's not the same. When you pour a cup of soda, right, and you pour it straight out, there's always a foam on top. So you're not really, again, you go to the counter and you want to buy a glass of soda from the fountain, and you're not getting the value of what you pay. So that's how subtle it is. That's how subtle it is. So what does this pasuk tell us? This pasuk tells us that you cannot use the normal overarching principles of Gezel, which is taking something from someone through sort of robbery or ribbis, all of that. We need each of these separate because they come to tell us something more than just that you can't cheat from somebody. Cheating from somebody, we know, that's Gezel. Once you take it from someone, everything that the Torah tells us comes back to Gezel. So it's a legitimate question. Why do you need a separate pasuk? If I would just say Gezel, I would know every instance where I take advantage of you and I take something from you, that's Gezel. The teretz is because there are things that are so subtle that you wouldn't necessarily think of them as Gezel. You wouldn't think that if I bought a cup of soda and had foam in it and it didn't have the full measure of the liquid, that would be Gezel. So this is the chiddush of the pasuk that how careful we have to be in everything that we do. Is that it has to be like we say kechut hasara. It has to be exactly the measure of what we are buying. If we're buying 16 ounces, it has to be 16 ounces. If we're buying a gallon, it has to be a gallon. We can't shortchange someone and say that's okay because that's the course of business. So that's the chiddush of the Torah when it tells us. Okay, when it tells us this, let's take a look at Rashi. Rashi says, okay, let's go to the top of the year. Generally, the Schiros Kosov Lav de Gezel Losasha. Okay, this has to do with Losasha because it says Gezel in the same pasuk, so therefore we interpret that it means that there's a double avera. Well, signavu dixiva monolomally. So the Gemara asks, why do we need those signavu? It's the same thing. Lelef meribis loino shahar mechasr moment, because the underlying principle is that he is losing money, mechasr moment. Loitignav the arseres hadibros. Oh, this is what I mentioned before. The arseres hadibros lokum boyale. Da'atzhara legoinev nefashis. You can't learn it out from the arseres hadibros because that geneva is not geneva of money or of intention. It's genevus nefashis. Geneminim b'sanhedrin. The Gemara there said that's what it means in the Torah. Okay, lemeka l'tzayer. In other words, I just want to annoy the fellow. I want to make life difficult for him. That's also considered geneva. Amnas l'shulam tashlumei kefel sherotze lahanasa b'yadei bo shelo yikabel. He wants to give someone. Tanuchi wants to give him a gift, and he won't take it. The only way he'll take it is if I steal and I'm penalized and I give him extra money. That's the gift. So you said that's surreptitious. That's also a signal you should even the to'elas, even if it's a good thing, you're helping him. That you shouldn't do. Again, if someone doesn't want to take a gift, he doesn't want to. He doesn't want to take a gift, and you want to give him a gift and find a way to give him a gift, so you steal his money. Okay. Lav the mishkolos losase ovel, right? The tome mishkolos of an amona or a pras for more or for less. Tomen b'melech. Oh, so the lachbido shelekeach b'mishkol lekeach be'elu. So what's he saying? That it means for gain or for loss. If you dip it in the salt. So if he'll buy it on the weight, then he'll wind up taking more from him. Again, I don't quite. I was thinking about this, and I know that the Gemara tells us that it works both ways, not just that a seller can cheat a buyer, but a buyer can cheat a seller. But I don't recall exactly how that would happen. So I have to think about it. If you can think about it, let me know. But I have to think about how, by using this mechanism, the buyer can cheat the seller. Okay? Mishas asiya. So the isser is mishas hatmana. From the time you dip it in the salt, so I feel a little shakal behen. Even if you don't use this mishkal in the future, you're over a lav if you bury it with the intention, I'm going to use this mishkal. That's already an isser. That's a tremendous chiddush because every isser is after the fact. You do something after the fact. This is b'machshava, right? This is b'machshava alone. He has an intent, and the intent is what if a person has intent to murder somebody, he's not over unless he murders somebody, right? That's the classic. So again, here Mishkal, that's the finish of this particular pasuk. So you did la'acher b'meisachama. You shouldn't measure one person in the summer, right? Et lach like it's a sadeh. You come to divide the field, and you want to break it into pieces. He shouldn't measure a measure for you, a measure for the other guy, because the rope is wet, called sarko, and it expands, right? And the other person gets musachama until she yobsho, he dries out, right? So who nigmad v'chazim. So in other words, you have to be uniform when you're in dividing for people, because then you're going to cheat one person for the expense of the other. So that you have to, again, that's how careful you have to be. Mesura midas halachi. That has to do with the wetness, meaning liquid. Okay, so Ashkumina balaz shemamale as hamida. You fill the mida kushemoitzis hayayin alachazman nimsa chasora. So again, he's talking about wine, and by wine, I guess there is a when you pour the wine and you let it sit, it seems to settle and maybe be a little bit less than it was. So maybe this is what he means. But yasiach means the foam that you pour. I don't necessarily see it by wine. I see it by other liquids, but by wine, we don't really see by wine that when you pour wine, there is a liquid or it's not frothy. It's not like when you mix
Bubbles.
it up. What's that?
Bubbles.
Bubbles. But again, you see how careful the Torah tells us how careful you have to be with all of these inyanim, that a person shouldn't cheat someone else, even if it was kind of unintentional, because he just poured the liquid in. He poured the milkshake and had a froth, and he gave it to him. And for that, you can be over alav. Okay, so all right. So now we at least understand to the degree why this pasuk is enumerated, even though we have the Isur of Gezela and the other Isur. Okay, now, so that same brisa goes on and says, we should be able to learn out what we just said from a kal v'chomer. Ma mesura shi echad mishloisha belug. What is a mesura? It's a measure, and typically then at the time of the Gemara, the measure measured lugim. Lugim was it's like ounces, let's just say. So a mesora that he would use would be 1/36 of a lug. Okay, so a lug is broken down by 36 portions, and this measure is one. That's how you measure it. Measure 2, measure 3, measure 4, and you can buy a half a lug or a quarter of a lug, whatever it happens to be. But that was the way they measured it. Now, hakpada of Torah, the Torah was makbid that when you use this measure, you have to be very careful that you shouldn't take it, and in that measure there isn't full liquid, right? Because it could be bubbles, it could be something else. So madach by mesora, where you're measuring for an amount of a lug. Hakpada Torah, kal v'chomer, certainly lehin v'chatzihin u'shlosha sahin reviya sahin. So if you're doing it for a lug, which is in other words, it's a minute measurement. What's 1/36 of a liquid? It's almost, you measure it. It's very little. If you're sort of peeling off a little bit of that. So it's kal v'chomer if you're doing by a hin, which is a much larger measurement, right? Why do we need a separate halacha to tell us that you have by log and by hin, you also have to be careful not to give him less than the full amount, meaning if it's bubbly or it comes to a head, that you can't count that. So the Brisa says we learn from kal v'chomer, madach by a very small amount, which in many ways is immeasurable, because what's 1/36 of a lug? It's so small that if there's a little bit of froth, how much are you really taking off? You're taking off a de minimis amount. Then certainly by a larger measure, where you have bubble and froth and not non-liquid, non-actual liquid, then of course it's an isser. So that's the Gemara. So the kasha is it's a kal v'chomer. Why do we have to enunciate separately that there is a prohibition from doing it by a lug, which is echos mishlosha v'shisha, and then there's a separate isser for by a hin, which is a larger measurement. It's a kal v'chomer. Of course, you can't do it. So, so that's the kasha. That's the kasha on the brisa, and the question now becomes why there has to be a separate amount. So that kasha, the Gemara actually doesn't give us a teretz here because it would seem that once they're talking about measures, that they're just mentioning all the different measures, and the Gemara asks the kasha, why do you need the second half of it? We understand that a person who sells with a froth, with a amount which is less than the full liquid, should always be belav. Will always be belav. So why, in fact, is there a separate amount? So that the Gemara sort of leaves that as a kasha. So it's a good question, right? Once you know that froth is an isser because you're not giving the exact amount, what difference does it make if it's a very small amount or a large amount? Maybe you would think, with a small amount, it's insignificant, so therefore maybe you shouldn't. There shouldn't be a chiyuv, but that's not what the Gemara is telling us. So again, the hakpada, how exact we have to have the sort of brought down, but the storekeeper has to have tremendous yiras shamayim because everything he does, if he cuts even a slight corner, he's over a lav. It's not like, you're in business and okay, so you don't steal from someone. You're much more careful. But when you're dealing with foodstuffs or other things that require an exact measure, then if that measure isn't, in which case you have many situations. The Gemara brings down where you had erlicha storekeepers who always measured, and then they gave someone on top of the measure, they gave them a little bit extra. And that extra was in case, it was a precaution. In case my measure wasn't 100% and I'm a little bit off. So I'm giving you, like we used to buy sliced meat, and we'd get a sliced meat, and at the end, after he waited, the fellow would take another slice and put it onto the. Now, by the way, I noticed this also. If people are makbid, for instance, if you buy a food that also has liquid in it, like let's say coleslaw as an example, and many others. So the question is, the source of the coleslaw is not really what you're buying. You're buying that to help keep it keep it warm. I've actually seen situations where a person, I have it here in a store in Miami, they seem to be makbid, where they sell you the item, they drain it. In other words, they actually drain it from the liquid, measure it based on the substance. Then before they give it to you, they pour back liquid into the box so that it should be moist. But they don't want to charge you.
Right. Like a lot of canned goods are like that, where it'll say net weight, presumably without the liquid.
Right. So you're really getting the net weight, even though there's liquid, right? But many proprietors aren't so makbid, they'll give you the whole thing. So I notice it, and I'm really very, I thank them for doing it that way, because some things you wind up paying for liquid that is very nice, but that's not the substance. Anyway, so this is how the Gemara ends, and it comes to this conclusion. Now, we can start the next section. The Gemara says, Omar Rava, Lama likosav Rachmana Yitzis Mitzrayim Beribis. Okay, the parsha of Yitzis Mitzrayim, in the pasuk, it says, the pasuk, it says, for instance, in Vayikra, it says, by neshech, let's say. It's kaspacha loisitin loch beneshech ubamarbis, right? So tzitin ochelcha, and then at the end of the pasuk, Ani Hashem lakechem asher tzeitzei Mitzrayim. This occurs in many of the isurim. The last half of it is, I took you out of Mitzrayim. What does taking out of Mitzrayim have to do with the Isser? So this is what the Gemara wants to ask. Lomedi because of Rachmana Yisiyat Mitzrayim beribis. Ribis is ribis, and leave it there. But it says, Ani Hashem Elokeichem asher tzeitzei eschem Mitzrayim, right? And we see this not just by ribis. Says the Gemara Yitzis Mitzrayim gabi tzitzis. You have the mitzvah tzitzis, Ani Hashem Elokeichem asher tzeitzei eschem Mitzrayim. And you see Mitzrayim by mishkalos, by measures, by the weights. It says the same thing. So this is an overarching question of what is the connection between taking you out of Mitzrayim and the Isser that the Torah is trying to focus on. So Omar Rava says, Omar Kodesh Baruch Hu, the Rabban Yisraelim says, Ani hu shehivtchani b'Mitzrayim. All right, I understood. I understood that from the time of Mitzrayim, being tipor shel bechor letipor she'en shel bechor. So listen to this. By the Makkos Bechoros, the Torah tells us that the kol bechor be'eretz Mitzrayim. What does that mean, kol bechor? So the Mefarshim explain that there was a bechor from a mother and a bechor from a father. So, for instance, if a woman gave birth, her firstborn would be the bechor. But what happens if a woman gave birth to a bechor from more than one man? Let's say she had a bechor from one man, a bechor from a second man. Is that a bechor? Says the Torah that kol bechor means any possible bechor that there could be was slain on Makkos Bechoros. Now, how do you know? So here the Gemara says that the Rabban Yisraelim at the time of Mitzrayim understood between tipa shel bechor, the semen, the sperm of a bechor, the tipa she'ena shel bechor. He was able to discern who was a bechor, who was not a bechor. In other words, if a child was born from a man and then he had a second child, that second child wouldn't be a bechor. But how do you know all of this? I mean, it's very, very difficult to. So he says, Ani hu shibchanti b'Mitzrayim. I understood in Mitzrayim. Kaviyach. What was a bechor and what was not a bechor, right? Ani hu she'osed lifroa. I am, Rabbi Shalom saying, I'm the one who's ultimately going to judge who is to be punished, who's not to be punished. Misha tola ma'osa benachri. Misha shetola ma'osa benachri umiva oisem liyisrael beridus. What does it mean? I'm going to be surreptitious, and I'm going to say to you, I'm lending you money on behalf of Michael, who is a non-Jew. Okay, Michael's not Michael. I'm going to put on Michael. Yeah, a fellow's a non-Jew. I'm his shaliach. I'm going to lend you his money, but we know that there's no ribis by a nachri. There's no iser of ribis by a non-Jew. So therefore, you're going to have to pay the interest because it's coming to the non-Jew. It's coming to this fellow who I'm representing. Who will know that? The Rabban Shalom will know that, right? That's what he's trying to say. Just like the Rabban Shalom was able to discern who was a bechor, who was not a bechor, he's also able to discern who is, in other words, whether you're lending money beribis and it's correct, and it's correct. Also, when misha time in mishkalas b'melach, and also who is using the salt to alter the weight. Misha taila kala ilam b'migdai. And this is another chiddush, right? We know that there's such a thing as tcheles, but tcheles is a very, very difficult thing to ascertain because it comes from an animal, a fish called the chilazon, which is, by all intents and purposes, they say that the chilazon only appears once in 70 years. How do you know what is blue? So what people do, unfortunately, is they dye it in something else, and they say that that's techeles. How do you know? How do you know if someone's erlach if he's really selling you techeles? So this is what the Gemara means by saying that it's Rabbi Shalom. So therefore, it has to say Asher Haitzesi Escha Meretz Mitzrayim to compare, just like the Rabbi Shalom took you out of Mitzrayim. And he knew who was a Bechor, who was not a Bechor, even though on the face of it, it was impossible to determine. But the Rabbi Shalom was able to determine. So too, and that's why it is appended to all these Isurim, so too the Rabbi Shalom will know if what you're doing is correct. And therefore, it has to do with Mishkal, it has to do with measures, and it has to do here, he says, with even tzitzis, which, I mean, again, how would you know? The Rabbi Shalom knows. Therefore, it says, by tzitzis, asher hachesis chametzitzrayim. So what he means by tzitzis is the dyeing of the tzitzis tcheles, that you can't get away with that because the Rabban Shem is going to know. That's why the words Hatzesius and Mitzrayim is appended to every pasuk for someone to say, wait a minute, before I do this, who am I trying to deceive? Okay, I'm trying to deceive you, or am I trying to deceive the Rabban Shem? The Rabban Shem will know. So again, we say that that's the purpose of Hasra, is that if a person knows that Rabban Shem is watching, that he won't do his surah. So if the Baruch Shem is watching, because you have a beferish apostle that says don't do it. Don't use a false measure. Don't cheat someone in ribbis by saying it's not ribbis because it's a goy. Don't cheat someone by tzitzis because you're going to say that it's really techeles. So all of these are matters that a person should be very careful from. So we'll finish with the Rashi. Yitzias Mitzrayim gabi ribbis. The Parshas Bahar Sinai, Gam Mishkolos Bigdoshim Tiyu, right? Shebachanti Mitzrayim, Ar Shebo Asora Riyukim Mitzrayim, Acha Mitzrayim, Acha Sunis Abra Mehen Be'eser Iburin. A person got pregnant 10 different times, but each time it was from a different person, right? To Eser Becharis. These are 10 bechorish. Shehem bechorish alavian. We call them mesim. So again, you would think a bechor, like a woman gives birth, right? If it's to one man, it's very clear. Okay, the firstborn to that couple is a bechor. But when a woman had, especially in Mitzrayim, where they didn't have the ethics that we have, women often had children by many different men, and the bechor by each man is a bechor, even though it's not her bechor, right? Or Toilam, so that's the Chiddush. Toilam Ma'osav B'Mnachri, Malva Ma'osav L'Yisrael B'Ribas V'Omer Shal Nachri Heim. In other words, he's being surreptitious and saying, it's not my money, it's Yenem's money, and he's not a Jew, therefore you have to pay. Okay, so we'll stop here. But again, we're not quite back to Neshek HaMarbis, but you see how this totally unfolds. Is that it's kind of hasra, really. It's a warning that when a person does anything that sort of is on the cusp of whether it's correct or not, then they say that's why a person wears tzitzis outside. Okay, why do you wear a beged outside, not inside, tucked into your pants? Is because when you look at tzitzis, then again, it's supposed to be tcheles, but let's say even regular tzitzis is not tcheles. It's supposed to remind you of Yitzias Mitzrayim, especially if it's real techeles. It's supposed to remind you of heaven, and heaven is a vital shalom that you shouldn't do something wrong. But either way, tzitzis and tzitzis, and therefore the hasra is that you should always have moira of the malchus. You should always have fear of heaven, and therefore you won't come to lav. But anyway, we see how this is all woven together, starting with ribbis, because we talk about different psukim and why this is also, and this is also. So now we've come to the point where Gemara will continue on this theme, but at least we understand in principle why Yitzias Mitzrayim is attached to all of these Isurim, because they're unknown to you, but they're known to the Rebbeinu. Right? So we'll stop here. And